This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
So we're here just for the last contemporary fiction seminar of this term. Hopefully we'll have something to say, just a special one-off session when we come back after Easter. And I'm really glad to have Dr. Ranu Samantrai from Indiana, who's here to speak on Black British fiction. And what I'll do is I'll just hand over to my colleague, Dr. Bianca Leggett, who will introduce Ranu and chair the discussion. So over to you, Bianca.
Thank you, Tony. Yes, well, we're delighted to welcome Ranu here today. Just in the UK for a few days, I understand, so we caught you while you're here. So Ranu is Associate Professor of English at Indiana University in the US. She's the author of, how will we say this, Alternatives. I do like that. We saw that, why haven't I used that before? It's wonderful. Alternatives, Black Feminism in the Post-Imperial Nation, which is published from Stanford University Press in 2002. And also the co-editor of Interdisciplinarity and Social Justice. So she'll be talking to us today about history subjects, race and national reform.
Thank you. I've been working mainly in the 1970s and the 80s, broadly in the 50-year period following the war, but primarily in the moment of the coming into being of the new Black national subject, the Black British subject. And I've been curious in the last 10 years or so to see how quickly a field is coming into being called Black British Cultural Studies or Black British Literary Studies. And the speed at which the conventions of this field are being sedimented is of some concern to me. So I've been thinking lately about the specific conventions, the gestures that seem foundational to the field, and I'm going to try to talk about a couple of those today. The paper will proceed in three, I hope, brief parts, broken up for easy listening. I'll talk first about well, let me do a little introductory material, and then the first part will be on an essay by Stuart Hall on ethnicities that gets quoted a lot, and was very foundational, I think, it's about 20 years old now. It was quite foundational in the early moments of Black British studies. And I'll talk about the sort of model of history and agency at work and in that essay, and I'll try to demonstrate that in the second part of the essay in Andrew Levy's Small Island, and I'll conclude with a few reflections in the final part. So, okay. The intellectual foundations of Black British studies derive from the important work of scholars, artists, and activists starting at least as early as the 1970s, include key propositions that situate the formerly colonized subject as a privileged agent of historical change. To summarize, among them are, first, a progressive but vaguely dialectical theory of history. Second, that history itself is driven by political life, characterized by the oppression-resistance dynamic, or in equivalent terms, we call it the progressive hypothesis. Third, we need to pause for a moment.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. Right, okay, third, with agency itself figured primarily through tropes of mobility, which is something that might address in the discussion. And then fourth, with narratives that are structured primarily in the heroic mode. The migrant, for instance, to make all this a little bit more concrete, the migrant, for instance, crosses geographic borders, which movement is tantamount to transgressing metaphoric borders. The motion initiated from the margins reverberates out to be enormously consequential for the center, where coherence is destabilized as borders are punctured. Because the entities that define the center, in this case nation and race, organize the known world, change at that level is the motion of history itself. And so the migrant's individual and possibly idiosyncratic journey is slotted into the tale of the underdog's heroic struggle against great forces. One such story is the tale of the post-colonial migrant transformed into the Black national subject, as a consequence of which race and nation are themselves transformed. Consider, for instance, the very concept of Black Britishness, now firmly established in the national imaginary. It is difficult to remember that scarcely a generation ago, the concept was for many outlandish. For its apologists, the monarchy rejected the demand for assimilation into a normative white Britishness and altered the presumptive racial terms of national belonging. By contesting the racial closure of the nation, Black Britishness promised to destabilize the foundational assumptions of romantic nationalism. It would do so by replacing biological essentialism with political contingency, such that the nation imagined as an enclosed community of kin would give way to a fluid collective of disparate peoples brought together by their joint history. Thus, the Black British, having defeated the nationalist or racialist vision of a protected homogeneity, would be avatars of a better world organized on the principles of multiplicity and inclusion. And that's what the story was supposed to be. But the call of nation has proven surprisingly resourceful. Rather than fatally unraveling an exclusionary enclosure, Black Britishness itself has become assimilated and nationalized, ironically through the very device of a shared history. The post-colonial migrant becomes the Black national subject. In so doing, she or he lends credence to the nation as the expression of our utopian hopes. Is it possible that even as it undermines the alibi of the nation as the political manifestation of an organic folk, Black Britishness provides a new reason to regard the nation as the form taken by the telos of progressive history? In literature, the discourse of nationalism has been challenged effectively through the retelling of iconic moments in the nation's history. The historical turn, dominant in British letters since the 1980s, has been put to good use by those seeking to authorize the Black presence in Britain. For instance, by re-narrating the nation's past as always already multicultural or multiracial. But works such as Andrew Levy's Small Island or Richard Bean's England People Very Nice indicate that even as we break with biological or cultural essentialism, historical narratives can step in to suture symbolic borders. In both those texts, the impact of globalization is neutralized by the nation. Indeed, threats to ideological closure provide the necessary drama for the teleological story that posits the past as the deep history of the present. Of course, this is not inevitable. Other works such as Bernardine Evaristo's The Emperor's Babe and Carl Phillips's A Distant Shore play with the relationship between past and present so that neither can guarantee causality or be subsumed to a telos. In doing so, they script blackness as the thin edge of globalization with the potential to expose the ruses of the nation. But before reaching for that transcendence, I think it instructive to delve into the scene of the formation of the Black national subject in order to scrutinize its mechanisms and to reflect upon its implications. So, this first section, the Banana Boat Armada. In the midst of delineating vast global and epistemological shifts in his oft-quoted essay on ethnicity, Stuart Hall enacts a little drama between England and its post-colonial settlers. Much of the essay is devoted to explicating the untethering of the modern South from its moorings in what Hall identifies as the great stable collectives of class, race, gender, and nation. The nation serves as prime example of a collective under attack from above and below, within and without. And I'm quoting Hall, besieged from above by the interdependence of the planet, it simultaneously, he says, is fragmenting as people in groups and tribes who were previously harnessed together in the entities called the nation-states begin to rediscover identities that they had forgotten. At least two responses are possible to such challenging conditions. For Hall, one tack is exemplified by Margaret Thatcher, the Prime Minister who promised to make Britain great again. Thatcher's promise amounted to a determination to revivify an imperial Britain, to restore an almost lost ideal that is capable of providing a secure tether in a world of flux. And indeed, with the victory of Argentina regarding the Falklands, Malvinas, she was able to declare the rediscovery, that's her words, the rediscovery of ourselves. This is a quotation from Thatcher. We rejoice that Britain has rekindled that spirit which inspired her for generations past, and which today has begun to burn as brightly as before. Britain has found herself again in the South Atlantic, and will not look back from the victory she has won. End quote. This tactical retreat to a better past, or rather this determination to prolong a narrative from the past, regardless of its obsolescence, is for Hall the essence of Thatcherism. And I quote from Hall, Thatcherism is in defense of a certain definition of Englishness. England didn't go to the Falklands or inadvertently. It went because there was something there about the connection of the great imperial past, of the empire, of the lion whose tail cannot be weakened, of the little country that stood up to the great dictator. It's a way of mythically living all the great moments of the English past again. End quote. But, as Hall tells the story, Thatcher's ambition to consolidate an identity at home by imposing a presence overseas was checked by some other British folks. the great wave of post-war migration from South Asia and the Caribbean. With gleeful flourish, Hall declares, just in the very moment when they decided they could do without us, we all took the banana boat and came right back home. In Hall's account, two armies, or rather navies, since both are aquatic expeditionary forces, face off. The stage for this drama is history itself. On that battleground, the two forces are not equal. The first force, the English Armada, redoubles on itself. Having pushed outward, it returns to its true mission at home, the rediscovery of its past self. Its victory is the efflorescence of the past, its journey home, a return to that past. All the activity of this force accomplishes a nearly closed loop, having nowhere to remain and nothing much to do in the Falklands. The English Armada comes about in the middle of the Atlantic and returns home. It thus draws the slide back to itself and is left finally floating free, alone, self-enclosed, anchored to nothing but its own deep past. The second force, the advancing wave of migrants and settlers, is unidirectional. It does not turn back. Unlike English battleships, this armada of banana boats has landed successfully. We now stand, declares Hall, bringing the expeditionary force to shore. And the stealth force adapts quickly to its new home and forges its own path to the future. And from Hall, I quote, every time they walk out on the street, some of us, some of the other, are there. There we are, inside the culture, going to their schools, speaking their language, playing their music, walking down their streets, looking like we own a part of the turf, looking like we belong. Some third-generation blacks are starting to say, we are Black British. This is a victory speech, dipping over into triumphalism as its repetitions emphasize the surprise scope of the conquest. But the conquest, although proceeding through the repeated confrontations of we and there, has a twist, for in victory the conquerors themselves are transformed. In the space of two sentences, settlers morph from outsiders and newcomers to part owners, not a complete takeover, admittedly, to belongers, to an entirely new being, one specific to this place. At the end of the paragraph, they have dropped away, and only we remain. The contrast is dramatic. Whereas the English appear to have no option other than hoping for time to stop and for the past to continue without end, their former slaves and servants own the future. Moreover, the failure of the English strategy is inevitable, for even should past selves struggle on, they will find their safe home, their place of retreat, transformed from the inside. They cannot avoid obsolescence, in sharp opposition to the beings that can adapt, thrive, and so shape the future. If the English are not to be cast adrift in a future in which they have no secure place, their only hope is to, as Hall says, share the turf, the ground where, as Hall has already declared, the Black British now stand, and where, presumably, all old selves must give way to new. Victory and defeat, then, are not straightforward, for both lead to a new settlement forged by transformation and sharing. In the same manner, past and future are interestingly nuanced. The Black British are harbingers of the future for Hall because this identity does not stake its legitimacy on an essence, be it biological or racial, the essence of the folk or romantic nationalism. Instead, it is situational and experiential, evolving in response to the conditions of its existence. This is the great lesson of the notion of Black Britishness. Rather than clinging to obsolete collective structures that are everywhere in disarray, Black Britishness offers a useful model of a mobile identity. Especially as we move from modernity to post-modernity, its way of doing identity evidences the vanguard status of the Black British. But again, past and future are not allowed to remain in mutually exclusive opposition, just as he appears to be sounding the death knell for Thatcher's appeal to the past. Hall adds, the past is not only a position from which to speak, but it is also an absolutely necessary resource in what one has to say. There is much to honor in hidden histories, much to value in traditions and inheritances of cultural expression and creativity. Hall resolves the opposing poles of continuity and change by advocating a non-essential relation to the past, an attitude that acknowledges that we construe the past in part in response to the present. We tell ourselves the stories of the parts of our roots in order to come into contact creatively with the past. So this new kind of ethnicity, the emergent ethnicities, has a relationship to the past, but it is a relationship that is partly through memory, partly through narrative, one that has to be recovered. Here again, the Black British play a privileged role, as do the settlers who precede them. Already the Banana Boat Armada enacted a paradoxical journey. Imagining himself at the scene, Hall turns metaphors of imperialism on their head. We turned up saying, "You said this was the mother country." "Well, I just came home," he says. Of course, for many who made that voyage, the arrival was not a return, and not to a home, except in the metaphorical sense. That is, in the sense that turns the narratives of the past into resources for the present, the very process at work in Hall's rhetoric. When he declares, "We now stand as a permanent reminder of that forgotten, suppressed history," Hall proffers a model of a creative construction of the past. In his brief account, we see enacted the creative relation that puts the past and present into productive contact in such a way that the narrative of the past serves the needs of the present. These passages from Hall are an object lesson for writing history, particularly for those who look to the past as a resource for creating usable narratives for the present. The first principle we can derive concerns the persistence of the past, with attempts to jettison it, met by an unexpected haunting and a return of the repressed in the heart of the protected present. But, second, haunting also suggests that rather than existing as a fully recoverable experience, Patrick Thatcher, the past can be discerned only in its unexpected impact upon the present. We are not mired in the past, nor is its meaning fixed. On the contrary, its implications have to be interpreted within the terms provided by the present. Third, such creative construction, exemplified by the haunting of the former colonial power by its formerly colonized, has enormous consequences for the present. In the turn of the dialectic, it is the dispossessed that are best able to take advantage of the conditions of the present. Prepared by previous losses of their experiential worlds and already adept at reinventing themselves, migrants become avatars in the global transition from modernity to postmodernity. And finally, these newly privileged figures are also the hope of the nation's rescue. The nation can find a better future if it is willing to learn from those who would disavow and acknowledge itself as a shared space, co-created by settlers old and new. But in every strategy there are dangers. Hall is able to make enormous claims for the historical value and political efficacy of the Black British, but at a cost. Examining the scene of meaning-making, we see not only that positive narrative outcome, but also the meanings that are foreclosed as the past is made productive for the present. Here, a slippage is particularly revealing. Initially, Hall asserts triumph for a collective comprised of Jamaica, Pakistan, Bangladesh, India, of course already a representative sampling of the former colonies, but a gesture towards heterogeneity nonetheless. That representative gesture gives way as Jamaicans come to stand in for all others, as when Hall says, "We're not Jamaicans anymore." The story being told is how the many become one, how the disparate peoples of the empire become the Black British. The story itself is the process writ small. In order to serve its narrative function, the new collective coheres into we by progressively shedding its original multiplicity, strategically preferring the rule of the same to the messiness of its past. Hall confirms as much with the story of how he learned to think of himself as an immigrant and Black, rather than as Jamaican. My purpose in this counter-reading is not to scold against the trap of identity formation with its inevitable homogenization and difference. Indeed, Hall uses his arrival story to caution against that premature closure and advocate instead a non-foundational identification that recognizes negotiation with difference as the condition of its possibility. And perhaps the process of generalization, homogenization, and substitution is necessary to construct a portable narrative that allows multiple paths to lead up to this present. All linear historical accounts posit a causal relation between past and present. The nation is hardly alone in excluding other possible meanings of the past. Rather than simply berating that gesture, I'm interested in thinking through its consequences. In this instance, the story of the Black British sutures the nation's past to its future. Besieged by the twin forces of globalization and localization, and with its imperial pilings crumbling, the nation requires another source of stability, authority, and relevance. It finds renewal as the location where the dialectic of history makes its next move, where the disenfranchised emerge into prominence and become the agents of history itself. And the nation aspires as a still privileged form of history. The Black British may instigate certain adjustments in content, but at the level of form, they provide the alibi for the continuing validity of the nation. We can read Hall's account along the grain of his intentions as the rescue of a weakened nation, or against grain as the success of a wily one. My objective is not to unveil a true meaning. More interesting is the separateness of meaning itself, evidenced in the multivalence of Hall's rhetoric and in the resourcefulness of a discourse as compelling as nationalism. Here we see how the claim of a shared history, intended to disrupt the logic of romantic nationalism with the introduction of contingency, can become the device that contains the threat of the Black British. By linking the imperial past to the post-imperial present and on to the multiracial or cultural future, this account of the Black British bridges over potentially disruptive fissures in the national story. Its protagonist might play the role of rescuing hero, but in Hall's linear history, the nation competes, perhaps successfully, for the role of telos. It eclipses the Black British because it is the ground of their existence in the present. Its present makes sense of their past, and it holds out the promise of a utopian future when it will be the site of the finally good, because diverse society. Part 2, an ethic of exchangeability. What are the consequences of the inclusion or conscription of blacks in the national story? For Andrea Levy, the consequences are both personal and social, she explains. Mine need to explore my own heritage, and to bring that heritage into the mainstream of British thought or British understanding is powerful. Her own father came to England from Jamaica in 1948 upon the now iconic Empire Windrush. By incorporating that family history into her fiction, Levy resists the collective forgetting that would discard certain pasts as not even worthy of history, not even worthy of being remembered, her words, forgetting that she regards as horror. Twinned to that personal or familial quest is the problem of a nation that, as the protagonist of Fruit of the Lemon puts it, is unaware of our shared past. To counteract that ignorance, Levy emphasizes the importance of bringing her parents' story, and, in her words, their parents' story, and their parents' story, into the mainstream of British culture. That is to say, she does not regard these stories as marginal or the experience therein as characterizing a minority. On the contrary, these historical experiences warrant recognition as forming the heart of a shared culture. In Small Island, Levy sets out to secure that recognition by way of the story the nation tells itself, about itself. The novel's 4 protagonists, 2 black, 2 white, are brought together in the London of 1948 as the nation emerges from the war victorious, but nearly devastated, with its grip on its empire beginning to loosen and on the cusp of a new chapter in its history. Hortense and Gilbert, arriving from Jamaica, take lodgings in a once grand, now decrepit house owned by Bernard and maintained in his absence by Queenie. At the end of the novel, the 4 converge around a biracial baby, the child of Queenie and another Jamaican serviceman. The baby, a literal manifestation of co-creation, is given by Queenie to Hortense and Gilbert. The narrative closes with the 2 new settlers assuming responsibility for this small citizen of the tired nation, as they leave to begin rehabilitating another decrepit, though salvageable, old house. Unusually, the novel, which has no epigraph, provides that authorial commentary at the end with the oft-quoted words of Winston Churchill. Never in the field of human conflict has so much been owed by so many to so few. Intended by Churchill to honor the RAF during the Battle of Britain, here the words acknowledge the many warriors and many battles represented by Levy's characters. Indeed, Levy finds the quotation wonderfully apt for the Jamaicans, the guys off the Windrush, this is her speaking, of which my dad was one, coming into this country and having to forge their identity and make this life for people like me. She muses, I just thought, I wonder if Churchill were alive, could I persuade him to say that this could be apt as well for the immigrant population? Answering her own question, I doubt it. She nevertheless redirects Churchill's gesture of honor. Normally reserved for combatants, Levy harnesses its affective value for the less glamorous stories of women and men, black and white, who maintained and revitalized a decrepit, though potentially salvageable country. This affective balance of Churchill's words, coupled with the intensity of the narrative climax as a child is relinquished by a grieving mother and hesitantly accepted by a hopeful new family, makes for a powerful plea to the emotions. The novel aims not only to persuade readers to accept a revised historical narrative, but to feel for black precursors as deeply as for white, as fully members of the national family. The form of the domestic melodrama casts an enveloping arm around black and white protagonists alike, drawing them into the familial circle as all participants in the drama that initiates the child's future. Levy thus aims to transform that intangible yet determinative quality of everyday collective life that Raymond Williams tried to capture as structures of feeling. If the reader accepts her account and responds affectively as directed, the novel contributes to the experience of conviviality, Paul Gilroy's term for the processes of cohabitation and interaction that have made multiculture an ordinary feature of social life in Britain's urban areas and in post-colonial cities everywhere. Indeed, Gilroy's optimism regarding Britain's structures of feeling provides an apt description for Levy's endeavor, and I'll quote from him. And this is Gilroy speaking just after the events of September 11th in the US. Even after that low ebb, half the country's yearning to be a different kind of place seemed worth noting, pausing over, and thinking with. A new set of issues had emerged to prompt the remaking of the nation's relationship with its imperial past, and to feed the hope that its buried and disavowed colonial history might become useful at last as a guide to the evasive multicultural future prefigured everywhere in the ordinary experiences of contact, cooperation, and conflict across the supposedly impermeable boundaries of race, culture, identity, and ethnicity. End quote for Gilroy. My reading thus far understands Small Island as an allegory of the nation. Indeed, the novel not only invites, but insists upon allegorical reading. The nation is figured as a house, owned by but not cared for by the Bligh men. The Bligh surname is shortened from Blight, a multi-valent echo that locates in the patriarchal tradition the substance of Old Blighty, while also identifying that tradition as the nation's blight. In Bernard's absence during the war, the house is maintained by his wife, Queenie, whose name is actually Victoria, yes, like the Queen, and under whose rule it draws in people from the far reaches of the world. Such allegorical reading can go on ad infinitum. But the novel also contains obstacles to allegorical reading. The decrepit urban house, for instance, departs from the pastoral convention of the country house as nation, and the characters are individuated in ways that hamper their representative status. Queenie's double name signifies not her proximity to, but her distance from the white women who benefit from the privileges of empire, as signaled by her desperation to rise to the middle class. Bernard is a failure as a patriarch, in love with a man, and unable even to engender his physical lineage. Arthur, Bernard's father, in the position of founder, patriarch, king, has been emasculated by the demands of his nation. Equally, on the other side of the racial divide, characters are unable to stand for a seamless blackness. Gilbert, the dark-skinned man who most identifies as black, is the son of a European Jewish father. Hortense also is fathered by a white man, and thus what we might call the bastard child of empire, yet is most emphatically not a rebel and has no intention of playing the subversive return of the repressed. Such point-by-point refutation of ideals and types orients us towards idiosyncrasies and details, the messiness of truth hidden by the too-neat myth. The novel thus makes a mimetic claim to the real and offers representation as the means for authenticating the black presence in England. Its claim of verisimilitude is substantiated by Levy's historical research, acknowledged by a citation in the novel and emphasized by the author in interviews and public appearances. And it is buttressed by Levy's references to her parents and her parents-in-law as models for her characters and sources of her stories. What should we make of the contradictory pull of this novel that at once demands and resists allegorical reading? Let us consider Levy's repeated reference to her father's arrival on the Windrush. On her personal website, Levy's biography begins. In 1948, Andrew Levy's father sailed from Jamaica to England on the Empire Windrush ship, and her mother joined him soon after. That is the first sentence of her biography. That this sentence precedes even her date of birth indicates the priority and weight invested in her father's story as an authorizing gesture. Levy can point not only to a metaphorical truth, but to a person who went through a historically verifiable experience. But her father is also one of the 492, the number of men who traveled on the Windrush to arrive at Tilbury on 22nd June 1948. The Empire Windrush itself is no ordinary ship. With the passage of time, it has become the flagship of the Banana Boat Armada. It has lent its name to a generation, an era, a story, a foundation, a jubilee, a city square, a garden, and numerous books. There is even a movement afoot to establish a public holiday on June 22nd to be known as Windrush Day. The event, as Matthew Mead puts it, has become metonymic of the post-war boom in immigration into Britain. Mead argues that although all manner of facts about the Windrush arrival are in dispute, including the number 492, Their repetition has the effect of cumulative sedimentation until the collective account renders the 492 migrants into something monumental. I'm quoting from me, the iteration of the windrush as a cultural symbol, and in particular of the figure 492, marks a transformation of the event from a collection of individual histories into a composite, symbolic, imagined, and monadic moment of arrival. Unquote. Inserted into the curiously empty container of the 492, Mr. Levy's story becomes an instance of a grander narrative. Its details are swept up by the ceremonial reverence conferred upon the symbol of windrush by utterances of memorialization. At the same time, even as he turns into a meaningful figure in a historical landscape, he does not lose his status as a discrete historical personage. He is simultaneously individual and typical, at once subject of a specific biography and representative of many biographies. Kenneth and Winston Levy, the author's father and uncle, traveled together. Mead notes that their names are borrowed in Small Island for the tenants of Queenie Blythe's ground floor room. On the one hand, this borrowing lends credence to the documentary quality of the novel. On the other, it suggests a substitution that aims for a higher, more abstract verisimilitude than that of documentary realism. Kenneth and Winston Levy can become characters in a novel precisely because they fill a narrative space. Their specificity can be evacuated, or it can take the place of other specificities which are, as a result, evacuated, eclipsed by a more urgent similitude that refers us away from the individual and toward the greater truth of the 492, the Windrush generation, the Windrush pioneers, and other such sedimented, consecrated symbols. This gesture of generalization and substitution is repeated over and again in the novel as the relation between individuality and typology is revealed to be fundamental to each character arc. In myriad small formal gestures, the narrative instructs the reader to move from the singular to the representative. For instance, Queenie's brother defends his generosity towards his impoverished classmates, saying, "But he were hungry, Queenie, he were hungry." He is echoed by Queenie's mother, who says of those who come to her back door looking for scraps, "They're hungry, Queenie, they're hungry." The repetition of syntax, as well as of words, lifts the utterances out of the discrete and transforms them into iterations of an incantation. Queenie's memories are no longer of unique incidents, but of a type of experience, the whole raised to the level of epic by the accompanying chorus, the fate of her mother and brother in her heroic narrative of separation.
Excuse me, could I just get the name of the novel and the author, which I didn't get?
Yes, it's the name of the novel is Small Island. Yes. The author is Andrea Levy, L-E-V-Y. Well, this is a moment to pause. Any other questions? Or Moreover, the novel relies on this gesture of generalization, homogenization, and substitution to develop an ethic of racial harmony, primarily by emphasizing cross-racial similarities. Characters that admit the possibility that they occupy a position that is equally occupied by others, especially others of a different race, are granted epiphanies and rewarded with agency that extends into the future. Those that do not suffer the silencing of obsolescence. And the ethic of exchangeability is articulated by Gilbert in the novel's climax as he appeals to Bernard to recognize their experiential and qualitative similarity against the enormity of which skin color does not signify. "You know what your trouble is, man?" he challenges Bernard, and I'm quoting Gilbert now. "Your white skin. You think it makes you better than me. You think it gives you the right to lord it over a black man. But you know what it makes you? You want to know what your white skin makes you, man? It makes you white. That is all, man. White. No better, no worse than me, just white. We both just finished fighting a war, a bloody war, for the better world we want to see. And on the same side, you and me. We both look on other men to see enemy, you and me, fighting for empire, fighting for peace. But still, after all that we suffered together, you want to tell me I am worthless, and you are not. Am I to be the servant, and you are the master for all time? No. Stop this now. Stop it now. We can work together." Gilbert's repetition of we and you and me emphasizes a shared history. In a neat parallel, his appeal ends with a potentially shared future. The narrative backs Gilbert's epiphany with demonstrations of the many similarities between the two men. Both join the RAF during the war, dreaming of the glory of flying, but neither gets the glamorous job he desires. Both spend their war on the ground, performing the tasks that allow others to soar. Nevertheless, both are moved by the deadly beauty of the war machine. Surprisingly, they share an aesthetic sensibility that appreciates that display of dangerous power. They share, too, a masculinity that recoils at the sight of a wife on her knees before men, present in flesh or in memory of another race. These parallels prepare the way to Gilbert's invocation of you and me, two figures in a landscape that could, in a pinch, stand in for each other. But Bernard does not assent to Gilbert's plea. At the other end of the spectrum in this cautionary tale, Bernard's we contracts over time until, like the incredible shrinking man, he disappears. He recognizes only one collective to which he might belong, the white English. Unfortunately, that identificatory ideal shrinks away from him. It is never a large collective. At the start, only the three other men with whom he socializes at his pub. It momentarily expands to white soldiers in India, but there again begins to contract, losing first the army, then enlisted men with leftist sympathies, then senior officers in the RAF. The gesture of distancing and refusing recognition of similarity is Bernard's core reflex. Accordingly, he is progressively isolated until there is no one else whom he recognizes as like him. First, he is the lone Englishman in a prison cell filled with Indians whom he does not acknowledge as in any way sharing his experience. Then, back in England, he isolates himself, believing himself to be suffering from syphilis. From this solitude, he never recovers. At home at last, he finds that his pubmates have been dispersed by the war, as the neighbor who shares his racial phenotype and racial fears escapes to the suburbs. Bernard refuses the knowledge made available to him by his war experiences and his encounters with the wider world. Consequently, the narrative grants him no epiphany or future. His final words, spoken in response to Gilbert's powerful plea, are, "I just can't understand a single word that you're saying." And with that admission of obdurate non-understanding, he vanishes. The other characters continue to speak and act. Even Queenie remains a textual presence to the very end, communicating through the objects she leaves with her child and through the twitch of a curtain that is her final interaction with Hortense. But all trace of Bernard ceases. Having refused the novel's moral, his punishment is erasure from the text, and from the future it proffers. The England he represents at the allegorical level of the novel, the England of patriarchal succession, racial homogeneity, and unquestioned imperialism, simply cannot continue. In between the poles defined by Gilbert and Bernard are Hortense and Queenie, and with the two women, the potential of substitution is realized. Again, the path toward the moment of successful exchange is laid with evidence available to the reader that the characters uncannily echo each other despite the racial divide. Each woman is of a class lower than she would like, and each struggles to rise to the level she believes she deserves. For that rise, each has to modify her speech to make it less the speech of the provinces and more the received pronunciation that passes for generic English. Although both women begin as snobs who lack empathy, they are able to learn through hardship to recognize themselves in others. For Queenie, that moment comes when a bomb reduces her to population. Though even then, she needs an additional prompt to accept that she is now one of those who need help, rather than one of the helpers. Similarly, Hortense holds knowledge of her lack of distinctiveness at bay, long past the Fanonian moment of interpolation that makes it plain to the reader. Not until all that she offers to the mother country has been rejected does she acknowledge to an old, dirty-smelling, poorly dressed black man the return of her nightmarish request, a shared experience of England's cold. Finally, both women desire the same man, and together are able to mother his child. Whereas mutual recognition between men is blocked, a liberal substitution takes place between women. An initial description of the final scene of exchange would see the women exchange the baby, and the baby as the object of exchange. But the scene can also be described thus. The women exchange positions relative to the baby. The women are the exchangeable objects. Queenie is the mother who gives birth to the child. Hortense, midwife at birth, becomes the adoptive mother who will rear him. Both are generalizable as mother. I am not suggesting that Small Allen jettisons race in favor of a universalism that makes deracination the fundamental human condition and assimilation the condition of national membership. On the contrary, Levy privileges experience, historical as well as ahistorical, as the generator of similarities and differences within and across racial boundaries. Race figures as a primary shaper of experience in the England of 1948, but the novel reaches for a beloved community in which recognition of mutuality is possible along and across lines of race, gender, class, and even aesthetic sensibility. We are all alike in having private conflicts, Bernard reflects, unknowingly naming the paradoxical commonality of distinctiveness at the heart of the ethic of exchange. Unfortunately, the lesson Bernard takes from this gain and understanding is that solitude is absolute, and each of us is trapped in our own pitiful story. His bleakness, though, is contradicted by the novel itself, the thing of beauty made from stories brought together. Characters are simultaneously idiosyncratic and representative, so that they can encounter each other in their difference and their similarity. Race matters because it signifies a boundary between similarity and difference, but also because it cannot guarantee complete similarity or absolute difference. Put another way, race remains significant precisely because it is the boundary that must repeatedly be crossed. Refusing its offer of order through segregation carries the ethical charge of Levy's story for individuals and for the nation. In The Biracial Baby, jointly produced by representatives of black and white, colonizer and colonized, male and female, Levy creates an emblem of the hoped-for national community that finds this legitimation not in an atavistic homogeneity, but in the experience of heterogeneity. Queenie, née Victoria, channeling Penelope, knits and unravels and knits again the same skein of wool until it becomes the knitted pouch that contains her legacy for the baby she relinquishes to Hortense. Then we know that the hero whose return she awaited was not Bernard, the husband, for she had been knitting before he left for the war, nor was it her lover, Michael, father of the baby, for she continued knitting after his departure. Her Odysseus, the hero who will save the nation, was the baby all along. And if the baby is the embodiment of a shared past and denizen of the future, the novel valorizes the nation's black citizens as its proper guardians. Crucially, these black citizens already contain whiteness within them. As in Hall, the nation is fortunate to have these already experienced guides as it faces a future of unavoidable heterogeneity. Far from being erased or assimilated, the Black British again play the role of rescuers, their very presence creating the opportunity for the nation to redeem its troubled past by embracing its multiracial nature. As individuals, Hortense and Gilbert act heroically in Small Island. As representatives, they are invested with the hero's task of bearing the nation's hope. Okay, and now the third section, which is short. Third section is called Empty Time. The past, writes Elizabeth Erma, however diffuse or hard to specify, is always seen in hindsight from a future vantage point which discovers a past that is by definition embedded in a controlled pattern of significance. The pattern, as in the case of Small Island, becomes apparent as 5 lives converge in one room. It becomes important when the exchange of the baby becomes the moment of the present, the brief, still point where the past meets the future. History is shaped here like an hourglass. The array of stories represented by the adults in the room pours into that scene, are bound together by the baby in a slim moment, and meld together into the past. Immediately after that compression, the adults disperse into the multiple possibilities of the future. But this future will be different from the past in one significant aspect. As it was being lived, the meaning of the past was not known, its pattern not apparent. The future, on the other hand, can be anticipated as the future of the baby, the new thing that organizes all that precedes and initiates all that follows this moment. Perhaps instead of hourglass, we should think of the transition from past to future as the squeezed passage through the birth canal, from which difficult journey, unknown, amorphous potential emerges in recognizable and meaningful form. And in a novel that demands reading as a national allegory, the birthing body is the body of the nation, the true subject of history. All possible paths become meaningful as trails to its present. From that convergence, it emerges battered, but ready to embark on a new chapter in its ongoing story. Both content and form align the narrative perspective of the nation, We've seen at the level of content how characters are rendered exchangeable, such that all are recognizable as monumental features of a single historical landscape. However diverse their stories prior to the moment marked as present, they are not contradictory or irreconcilable. Rather, the present reveals them to have been fragments of one story all along. The novel underscores that reconciliation at the level of form by dividing history into 1948 and before. The narrative present is 1948. All else is not other discrete times, but the before of this present, and literally the sections of the book are titled either 1948 or before, and we move between them. For Ermath, the medium of historical time, here exemplified by before, is itself a representation of the first magnitude. By analogy to single-point perspective in painting, she explains, quote, "The view of time as neutral, homogeneous medium, like the space of pictorial realism in painting, a time where mutually informative measurements can be made between past, present, and future, and where all relationships can be explained in terms of a common horizon. In single-point perspective, sight is rationalized by a pictorial space that extends from here to eternity without encountering any disturbing fractures. The temporal analog that links past, present, and future involves a different faculty, consciousness, and a different medium, time. But the same formation adheres. In history, that is, consciousness is rationalized by a narrative time that extends from here to eternity, perhaps encountering many disturbing warps, but no disturbing fractures. In history, all temporal perspectives, however widely dispersed, agree, in the sense that they do not contradict. In this powerful sense, they achieve a consensus tantamount to the creation of a common horizon in time, and hence of the power to think historically." End quote. Realized formally in the realist novel, the single-point perspective is evident in the omniscient, unnamed nobody narrators that literally constitute historical time by threading together into one system and one act of attention a whole series of moments and perspectives. That threading together gives Small Island its shape as it follows its protagonist's stories, telescoping dizzyingly from vast historical and spatial reaches to one house, then one room, then one climactic scene. Ermath is interested in the epistemological and literary consequences of what she calls the triumph of historical time, a world-shaping development traceable in the metaphysics of presence, in the structure of the human sciences, in the definition of subjectivity as individuality, in our laws, our experiments, our capital, and our knowledge, in short, in all that we hold dear. All these accomplishments rely on a collective faith that if each individual could see all the world, all would see the same world. Although she writes from the vantage point of the literary postmodern and hauled from modernity's crumbling political architecture, the two share an epistemological hypothesis of modernity threatened by postmodernity. To Ermath's list of things we hold dear, things that constitute our being and anchor us in a known world, we might add Hall's great stable collectives, which you might recall, include class, race, gender, and the nation. An extrapolation consistent with Ermath's analysis of the fragmentation of modernity's structural scaffolding. In Small Island, we see the powerful results of the triumph of historical time, as expressed by and in service to the nation. The novel's single-point perspective constitutes an implied spectator that coincides with the nation at the moment of its rebirth, or its transition from its before to its future. To serve the present needs of that subject, time is conceptualized as empty, homogeneous, and linear, capable of containing all the stories that are organized into a known pattern of the past for the present that causes the future. And the subject function identified by Ranu, one evident in the implied spectator of realist painting and in the implied historian of realist narrative, is in Levy fulfilled by the nation as telos of history. Moreover, in Levy, as in Hall, it is the Black British who make possible the nation's suturing not by loss and decline, but by rebirth and progress. The mechanism of interchangeability equalizes all characters' claims to national membership, delivering the homogenization necessary for all to be citizens. But, as we have noted, this peculiar generalization does not demand the erasure of difference and a consequent uniform Englishness. On the contrary, it requires diversity and celebrates the multiple paths to national membership. Hence, the novel's opposing poles of the idiosyncratic and the representative, figured as the heterogeneity of a multiracial society wherein race is the sign of the difference that must be respected and the difference that must be overcome. And therein, too, lies the continuing relevance of the nation at a time when, as Hall suggests, it is threatened by identities and affiliations that are shifting simultaneously to the local and the global. The nation that finds legitimacy as the political expression of its essential folk perhaps cannot survive the conditions described by Hall, but in this moment of possibly looming fossilization, it finds a new life as the necessary space where heterogeneity can be convivially lived. It provides the shape of the better world imagined by Gilbert, the form taken by the telos of progressive history, rather than signifying its proper destiny, thereby suturing through loss in the manner of Thatcher. The imperial past can be reconceptualized as but one stage in the nation's history. National history then becomes centrally about the protracted struggle between colonizer and colonized, and more specifically between white and black. The struggle is the shared heritage of black and white citizens, and the culture that results is their co-creation. In this rescripting, heterogeneity, by populating an interiority, is the sign of national exceptionalism, not the end of English distinctiveness. Although her notion of a jointly created culture echoes Hall, Levy diverges from Hall's insistence upon an unpredictable difference that remains a source of anxiety for the settlements of individual and national identity. For Hall, the past is not fully recoverable. It retains an improvised, at times inventive quality, while he points to still visible narrative scenes. If the alternative, that the accommodation of difference can supply an alibi for the nation, attends his account as an unwitting danger, in Levy, that meaning is embraced as the device that can move the Black British from margin to centre. But more than anything else, it is the harmonization of potentially irreconcilable multiplicity into a surveyable past existing in uniform time that affects the closure required to harness the Black British to the historical project called the nation. To be sure, the experience of a convivial multiculture, albeit one in the uneven process of becoming, is a great improvement upon social life experienced as a war of invasion and counter-invasion. For the previously disenfranchised, there is the further advantage of being the heroes who rescue the nation in its time of duress. Their presence signals its newly reinforced foundations and their successful struggle for inclusion, its utopian capacity. Perhaps, then, it is petulant to note that the Black British are themselves sutured by the nation in the story told by Hall and Levy. The nation is the condition of their possibility, and they find their significance in its meaning-filled history. The two entities, nation and national subject, are intertwined in a tautological loop, with the Black British conscripted to the destiny of the nation. Congratulated for their role in that destiny, they are also deprived of alternative outcomes. Certainly, they are celebrated as monuments of British history, but thus monumentalized, their impact can also be contained and any potential threat neutralized. For instance, in Small Island, the exclusion they contest is simply deferred rather than undermined, assisted by the strongly unifying single-point perspective that renders all possible stories into one story. The nation continues to find its cause in deep history. The black-white encounter replaces the organic folk as the essence of that history, a gesture that includes the Black British, but now closes the door behind them to all other non-essential claimants.
Thank you very much.